Bunch of stuff on the website, okay, including the next chapter study guide, which I got on there early. But that's not all. Okay? What else is on there is I went ahead and downloaded, I think you might remember, and I didn't keep up with it. And it's basically extra kind of review material for you. I am going to be talking about the feminist movement of the 19th century, but I had given you a PowerPoint on, I think, women of the 16th century, so I added 4 more, 16, 17, 18, 16, 17, 18, 19, so there's 4 more PowerPoints. These I found online. Download them onto your computer so that you can review and take a look at them. There's some names in there that I don't bring up. I can't cover everything. All right, so that's the first thing. Second thing I have sent you the next 2, or the next Unit 5 card list from 64 to 84. So we're going to cover 2 of these today, since I have a bunch of cards. Anybody want some? 2 cards? Okay, take 2 cards and pass them back. Let's just kind of set that up. If you have your own cards, fine. Take 2 cards for the first 2. Just good luck cards.
Oh, good luck cards. Good luck cards. Gotta have them.
It's good luck. Use those good luck cards. You can.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so listen. And again, on the you have a line side and a blank side. On the blank side, top right corner, put 64, and the title is 19th Century Feminists, and which you can probably just list them with one basic idea as I lecture it. Okay, the other one I want you to put down, you know what, I may not get to this one, because it's at the end of I probably won't in this class, but you can set it up. That's number 65, and that's called the Decembrist Rebellion, or I think revolt, the Decembrist Revolt, because it happened in December.
No way.
Decembrist. It goes all the way up December to B and Rist. Decembrist. 19th century feminists. Decembrist Revolt. Which is probably where I'm going to end up with, because I'm going to have to go a little bit further. Now, the other thing is it's really critical. I gave you a bunch of review handouts too on some of the isms, but there's 3 handouts on nationalism you need to bring to class tomorrow. Okay? Because that's really now what I'm going to be talking about. Now, where does this unit really kind of begin? Well, the Industrial Revolution, most of what we talked about is in the 19th century. So your notes on the Industrial Revolution, even the agriculture revolution, we can kind of put, since I didn't do a essay on that, no cards that preceded it, some of those, when I give you those cards back, some of those cards will, could be on when we do the next essay. The other thing is I'm going to have the DBQ a week from today. Okay? The DBQ will be on a Thursday, next Thursday. So I will do a kind of essay review since it's in the afternoon. Okay? I'll just go over the basics of DBQs. On that same day during tutorial. I will set that day aside, okay? Or if you have any questions the day before, I'm going to have you take your essay folders home so that you can pull out all the DBQs, lay them out in front of you, see what mistakes you've been making so we don't make the same mistakes again. You should be able to write the introduction paragraph now and topic sentences with both hands tied behind our back. But nonetheless. Standing on one foot. With one hand, with one eye closed.
Half a brain.
Okay, so.
Half a brain, that's why I failed them.
I'm going to talk now about this ism. Since the 19th and 20th century is the century of the isms. These are the other isms. I've spent time talking about the political isms, and I still will revisit to discuss socialism and get into communism more specifically with Karl Marx. But the other isms, including feminism, is a ism that emerges in the early 19th century. So we want to make sure you all remember that we want to use vocabulary in the right time frame. And we could go back to the Middle Ages with Christine de Pizan, who was a very rare high Middle Ages Renaissance period writer. That would be a precursor. We won't call her a feminist. We will call the women of the 19th and 20th century feminism. And we're going to have several pulses of feminist activity in terms of ideas here, as I talk about, and then in the 20th century as well. All right? Yes?
Can we say that she spread, or she was the start for like an early person to start feminist ideas, or do we have to say something else?
I would say instead with like the Christine de Pizan and a few others that are on the PowerPoint on the earliest, that they represent one of the earliest to promote women's rights versus saying feminism. Though I would bet you anything, you might look at the PowerPoint and they might use the term. But I want you to be using the term mostly in reference to the 19th century and the 20th century. So it is an early, and in fact the term appears first in France in the 1830s, okay, where some women in France referred to themselves as feminists. Now, our feminists are going to have some common ideas with liberals, radicals, and socialists. And in the case, we're seeing that our liberals, radical, and socialists they're all influenced by the desire to have increased rights, more rights. In the case of women, feminists, it will be women's rights. Liberals, it will be rights that we associated with liberalism, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, okay, natural rights. Radicals tended to, they could be liberals and socialists. A radical is someone who wants extreme change, but it has to do with rights. Socialist has to do a lot with rights of the workers, okay? So there's some commonalities there. All right. All right, now, I want, you also need to distinguish between English American feminists and French feminists. And I'm going to kind of go fairly quickly with you on this since we lost a little bit of time. Okay, so the English American feminists, we could call them egalitarian because they were more interested in political rights, especially the right to vote, and hold public office, so political rights. That's where the term egalitarian. Our French feminists, on the other hand, tended to focus more on social and cultural rights. There's a reason for it, but when we talk about social and cultural rights, what might we be thinking of? What kind of rights?
Equal pay.
Huh? Rights to divorce, keeping property brought into a marriage, children, access to children that always went to the husband, so divorce, education and careers outside the realm of politics. Huh? No. I'm sitting right in front of me. I'll go back over there one more time.
Oh, right there on the ground.
There it is, yep. Okay, let's see, what else? Education, did I say education? Yeah. Rights to education, and that kind of thing. So, and the reason for this, again, is, it really goes back to the French Revolution. And even though women played a role in the French Revolution, storming the Bastille and the Bread March to the women, our French revolutionaries did not feel that it was right for women to be involved in politics. What else contributed to that? The effect of? Effect of Marie Antoinette. I think that lingering effect of her control over and influence over Louis, that kind of lingered. So our French feminist writers tended to focus more on the kind of family side of it. But our American and English feminists tended to be more like the Mary Wollstonecraft, okay, who, you know, and even at that, can you think of one, maybe French, we might call a feminist writer, that met her end on the guillotine? Olympe de Gouges, if you remember Olympe de Gouges, okay. Okay, so let me give you a couple things. So this one here, I didn't put any, you're going to have to just write the background information here for these two. They were intellectual partners. But they didn't start off together because Harriet Taylor was married to someone else, and then when her husband died, they married. But they were intellectual partners and writers for 20 years. They tended to write, you know, beginning in the 1830s, about the inequalities of women. Now, John Stuart Mill is actually very famous. And he was an MP, so when I say MP from now on, it means no.
MP or MP?
Member of Parliament.
Oh.
MPs are members of Parliament. Okay, but his famous book was called, and you want to write this down, was called The Subjection of Women. Subjection, S-U-B-J-E-C-T-I-O-N, of Women, 1869. And in The Subjection of Women, he said basically that women were inherently, meaning naturally, equal to men. And he supported women's suffrage. So would these ideas of these two collaborative writers been widespreadly believed in? No. Okay. And in fact, I want to now introduce you to some political cartoons from a magazine called Punch that we're going to see a lot of in the 19th and 20th century. So Punch was a British political magazine, and in this we have a woman on the left approaching, and that we can tell is an MP, specifically Mill. Okay. How do we know that's an MP?
That's the wig.
Yeah, his clothing will tell her that. And then she's basically saying to him that she was informing him that until his speech, she just was not aware of what a miserable creature women were. Okay? Well, so what is that really saying to us?
They were raised to
That the
think
majority of women, you know, she's going to be an educated woman. She's shown as much larger than him. I think they're trying to say here that Punch was not supportive of Mill's ideas of women's inequality, and the magazines. What you're trying to do when you look at political cartoons is see, you're trying to figure out what's the opinion of the cartoonists in terms of what we're missing, what's being said down there because that's covered over. But you would be able to read it, and she says, "Hey, I was not aware that women were such miserable creatures until you told us so." Okay. Without the right to vote. But so Punch is following the traditional view that most people had, that women were not supposed to have political rights, okay, and such. Now I'll mention Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She's American, and she's associated with a really strong movement at a place called Seneca Falls, New York. And if you've heard of that, I think it might have been in your book. Okay, and she basically said women were created equal, and therefore they had the right to vote. And this was in 1848, which will be a pivotal year It's a couple of pivotal years you want to start locking your brain onto. So women were inherently equal to men, so therefore they had the right to vote. Great deal of resistance, and it really won't happen until the 20th century. But they're talking the talk of it in the mid-19th century. I want to mention Germaine de Stael a little bit, because she's very interesting. The cutest woman in the world.
Okay.
Rude.
She really does represent somewhat a unusual woman of her time, because she was very independent. Very independent. She did let her parents select her husband, though it was awfully hard to find one for her, because she was awfully independent. And so she eventually, her parents do finally round up a guy. He happens to be a Swedish diplomat. All right, they won't stay married. You know, they'll marry and they'll each help each other's career. She'll help advance his career in France because of who she knows. Her father is Jacques Necker, the finance minister, who was initially hired to try and convince the nobles they should be taxed, and then he was fired in 1781. Then he's rehired in 1788. And then that's going to be a pivotal event in 1789 when the nobles were trying to pressure him on the days before the storming of the Bastille, if you remember. The fear was that he was going to be sacked again and that the king was moving troops towards Versailles, and this is going to lead to the storming of the Bastille. At any rate, let me just say, she had a very stern mother, but here's what allowed her to take off. She had a doting father who was a banker, Jacques Necker, and when she was 12 years old, the French helped the Americans in their revolution, and she just became passionate at the age of 12 of American liberty and the word Constitution and such. And when she was 14, she wrote an article about Montesquieu's spirit of the laws. All right, so she was pretty well known, and she just traveled it and circulated through, high level society. Okay, the Queen didn't like her, Marie Antoinette, and so because of this, the father Necker purchased a chateau in Switzerland, so that she could have a place to go when she was periodically banished because of her books. And she started off as a Jacobin supporter, not a Jacobin member, but a Jacobin supporter, but then became more moderate, and then became a critic to the excesses of the revolution, and a major critic of Napoleon. Napoleon couldn't stand her. But Napoleon didn't like independent women anyway. So what else is new? All right. And her husband, even though they do separate, he is able to protect her from the Committee of Public Safety, who also didn't like her. And that's where, when she left during that time period to live in Switzerland and returned after Napoleon seized power. She was fascinated by Napoleon. She first said, okay, he's kind of a new kind of a leader. But Napoleon did not know how to deal or talk to political women that were savvy and conversational with political events. And so he didn't like her. And he often ridiculed or mocked females in company. He would make fun of them. So she would prepare herself before any potential meeting where Napoleon would be there, a party. She would have written down a piece of paper some real searing one-liners to zing at him. She really didn't like him. All right. But then here's what she said about him. She said she eventually didn't like what she saw. She said, far from being reassured, the more I saw Napoleon, the more alarmed I became. He is a man without emotion and a calculating chess player for whom people were either facts or objects. Every time I listened to him, I was impressed with his intelligence, she observed. But then she realized that any time anyone was staring at Napoleon, he then extinguished all signs of life in his eyes. and then he would have this kind of vague expression that would confuse anyone. But Napoleon recognized her as a troublesome adversary, and several of the books, one book she wrote extensively how great Britain was, another book she wrote how great Germany was, and he was afraid that that would enliven or flame up German nationalism, so he banished her. But he did say, they say that she does not speak of politics or me. But when it does happen, but why does it happen that whenever someone who speaks to her, they immediately dislike me? Okay, even though, so what she says about him is indirect, about a kind of person that everyone can recognize who he is, but then they don't like him, okay? So eventually she's banished, and she'll tour Europe, and she's gonna meet all sorts of people, Alexander I, the Duke of Wellington, Lord Byron. The English didn't like her too much because she was too supportive of the American colonists, okay? But she was really a very important personality of the time period. And it's ironic that she dies on Bastille Day, July 14th. It's a good day to die on if you're going to be.
It's a good day to die hard.
On any day of the year. Okay, I'll mention Flora Tristan, just as another. I want to give you some names you can put on your card. So far you should have, what names? You should have, I would put Mary Wollstonecraft on there because she talked about civil rights for women. She's English, but she's at the end of the 18th century. I would put down Harriet Taylor and John Stuart Mill. Because he was a feminist, but
Bless
he's a supporter of
you.
feminism. I would put down Germaine de Stael, Flora Tristan. See, what's interesting about Flora Tristan is that she was a socialist writer. Her father was actually Spanish, though in the Navy assigned to Peru, and her mother was French. She's considered to be a founder of modern feminism. So that's really what we might say, a founder of modern feminism. Or you might say, if you wanted to, about someone like Christine de Pizan, who helped lay the foundation for future feminism, okay? But a founder of modern feminism, and basically what she says is that, and she had to be kind of careful, all right? And by the way, Flora Tristan, she was the grandmother to Paul Gauguin. You all know who Paul Gauguin is? Okay, he's one of our post-impressionist painters that we'll see later on, okay? Paul Gauguin, spelled Gauguin. And she was a friend, knew Charles Fourier, the utopian socialist. But she stated that if women had freedom, this benefits the whole of society. It benefits men too. If women have freedom, men benefit. And society benefits. And she traveled extensively. She wrote about, since she was familiar with South America, she wrote about women in those areas as well. So she's another writer. Let's talk about George Sand.
What?
George?
Oh, what's that off?
Oh man, George.
Listen, 19th century.
Looking good.
10 names. Why? Yeah. Okay.
J.K.
And actually,
Rowling.
she was, let me see, friends.
Stop.
She collaborated with a Jules Sandeau, and that's where she took the name Sand. Okay, her name was Aurora Dupin, and she married, she was from aristocratic lineage. See, this is part of the problem for her, is she was of aristocratic lineage, but she's going to break all the rules of aristocratic society, okay? She was a distant relative of Louis XVI. All right, but she was aristocratic, so most aristocrats can kind of follow their bloodlines back to such. So, I mean, she says, my profession is to be free. She says the mind has no sex. She's Aurora Dupin, but everybody knows her as George Sand.
George, you've been working
She's probably one of the most
out.
important writers intellectual writers of the 1840s. And her writings portrayed really independent women. So very, very controversial, very famous. Controversial because she broke the rules of society. What did she do? She wore men's clothing. But that, you see, she wore men's clothing because she said they were cheaper and sturdier than clothing of women's nobility. You know, think about those. They were expensive and such. Plus, it allowed her to go to places where women couldn't go. In a way, she disguised herself as a man. So where could she go that she couldn't go because she was aristocratic? It's more because she was an aristocratic woman. She couldn't go to the theater. She couldn't go to museums. She couldn't go to libraries. Those were out of the domain, domain for aristocratic women. So she did it. Not only that, she smoked a pipe. Probably not good for the health, but she did. All right. And she had numerous, after she split from her husband, she lived with men outside of marriage. She especially was famous for being the mistress of Franz Liszt, okay, and Chopin.
Chopin.
And you will see a picture, you will see a painting of them together with her in it, okay? All right. But you see, here's the thing. She also, anyone that was looking for anything to scandalize her did. In fact, the famous expression was George Sandism, you know, which this whole notion, I think, of fathers saying to their daughters, you better not turn out like George Sand, okay? Meaning unconventional, okay? And such. So they even spread rumors about her with having an affair with another woman and that kind of thing. Whether it was true or not, we don't know. But she tended to break the rules of society. Okay, so those are your women. Some say she is sometimes referred to as the first professional woman's writer of fiction. And by taking a male name, she could claim equality. So because she wanted to be judged on her talents and not because she was a woman. Okay? And women began to copy her, as you know, as people do today with celebrities, how she dressed and her style, and even some taking on male names. Okay? Honoré de Balzac said, "What will become of the world when all women are like George Sand?"
Maybe we'll take your name more seriously.
Now I want to talk about nationalism. And this one is now key, absolutely key to the 19th and 20th century. All right? We associate nationalism with the French Revolution, but where we're going to see it arise in the rest of Europe. So in France, it's associated with the French Revolution. But outside of France, it's associated with Napoleon, and specifically a resistance to Napoleon that in essence becomes anti-French. Okay, star it, highlight it. It's the most pervasive ism of the 19th and 20th century. It's one of the 4 causes of World War I. We will be talking about, by the time we get to the middle of the 1800s, we're already going to talk about the seeds of World War I. So when we get to World War I, which is chapter 26, okay, I can do that war in one day, okay? Because basically I'm going to spend a lot of time building up to it, and then it's 4 years of trench warfare, done, over. 10 million dead.
Wow, I know everything about World War I.
Okay, so this one is really important. That's why those handouts, bring them tomorrow. Now, it's also going to overlap with 3 very important isms. you need to highlight these three. Number one is going to be referred to as Romanticism. Because after this PowerPoint, I'm going to do another art. Okay. Okay. It is also associated with republicanism, this idea of republic forms of government, republicanism and liberalism. The ideas associated with then natural rights and equality. Okay. I also sent you a kind of review sheet on the isms. Take you a little bit more into review to make sure you have all of that as well. Now, I want to distinguish between nationalism in Western Europe versus Central and Eastern Europe. Now, let me specifically say, in Western Europe, specifically Britain, France, and Spain, it's not associated in Britain, France, and Spain with nation building. Why? They were already there, okay? So it's a little bit different in Western Europe, specifically with regards to Britain, France, and maybe Spain. There it is something to be cultivated, encouraged when threatened, okay? It is something to be cultivated when threatened. The British are going to be very good at it. We'll see it a little bit later on when we get to the Crimean War. Go ahead, guys.
Have fun, children.
Okay. Or in France, with the threat of invasion. Okay. Now, in Central and Eastern Europe, and by Central and Eastern Europe, I'm talking about the German states, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, and let's not forget good old Poland, because the real seeds of nationalism were started in Poland when Russia and when the Rap countries sucked it up. Okay, so the German states, or the German Confederation, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman, and Poland. There, it's about nation building under nationality. Of the groups there, though, the ones that's the most important were Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans, because they were made up of a polyglot of nationalities, a huge polyglot of nationalities. Think Austria-Hungary, dominated by the minority Germans out of Vienna, or the Ottomans, who at this time period controlled the Balkan Peninsula with all those Slavic peoples. Those peoples are not happy being under the control of another nationality. So what those places want is independence, okay? They want nationalism to represent independence.
My leg's shaking.
And they are influenced by the success of Britain and France, because they were successful as early nation states. And they were powerful as nation states. Now, the German states, and the Italian states. Let me talk about first the German states. The German Confederation, the majority of the people were culturally German, but not united. They were the majority. We're going to find those in Bohemia are not German, but the majority of the Germans in the German Confederation were culturally German. And they're influenced by nationalism because of Napoleon's conquests. Now, our Italians, what's their problem? Besides their being fragmented, what's their problem? Austria has occupied in the north, okay, and then Spain is controlling Naples in the south. So what we started off in the Renaissance hasn't changed much. And then what did Napoleon do? Come in and conquer it and reorganize the northern states okay, and even take over the papal states. So they are, what they long for, and it's in Italian, they long for risorgimento, a resurgence. Of Italian glory. Last seen in the Roman Empire period. And then also in Eastern Europe, we have a Slavic revival. Our Slavic peoples also, what they long for is independence as well. We find them in, well, I mean, they're controlled by the Russians or Slavic, but they long for their own independence, okay, as well as independence against the Ottomans. Now, who is it that has to teach the people that they are actually German, Italian, or specific Slavic peoples? Well, it's intellectuals and writers. Because our Germans and our Italians, they tended to be more provincial. In fact, your German people, how did they look at themselves? They were either called themselves not German, but Prussian, Austrian. No, Hungary is a different, they're a different people. Hanoverian, Saxon, Bavarian, okay, all of them. They didn't call themselves German. Somebody's got to teach them they're German. All right, and then the writers and intellectuals also are going to begin to kind of standardize the various dialects of German, the High German and the Low German as it's known as. Okay, so let's get to Germany then. So what started off as the Holy Roman Empire, what later will be called the First Reich, is a place by the 18th and 19th century, is a place of flourishing German culture. So Beethoven, Goethe, Schiller, Herder, Kant, and Hegel. Of course, you all know all those names, right? They're on the tip of your tongue of German famous cultural contributors. No? Which ones do you know? Obviously, Beethoven. Who else?
Kant.
Kant you now know, okay? So Goethe is a writer. Schiller we're going to talk about as a musician. Herder and Kant and Hegel are all philosophers. Today we'll be introduced to Goethe and Herder, so we'll add to your names. In Germany is going to be ground zero for the Romanticism movement. It will flourish there more than anything. And when the Germans latch onto something, they embrace it 1,000%. And basically what the Romanticism movement challenged was the age of reason and the Enlightenment. We're going to begin to see a movement away from those values that were so strongly declared. Okay, a challenge to the age of reason. Enlightenment writers like Voltaire envisioned the same civilization for everyone. If everyone was educated throughout Europe, everyone would share the same civilization. Until then, 1780, the many Germanys did not feel German or know they were German. They were Prussian, they were Saxon. The many Germanys were not German. So there were, and the borders were very fluid. There were no real solid borders. They were fluid, you know, because of wars and territorial exchanges and all of that. So we have to enter into a Johann Gottfried Herder. So Johann is a typical, that means John in German. Gottfried is a nice German name. And it's not as period 3 said, Gottfried. Got milk, got fried.
They're retiring.
John got fried.
John got fried.
Now listen, he's gonna die really before his ideas then are going to leave a legacy for the 19th and into the 20th century. Because what he wrote in 1784 is that Germans were different than other peoples of Europe. And I emphasize different. He didn't say they were better or a master race. That would come later under Hitler. Okay, he said Germans were different than other peoples of Europe. And their real culture comes from the folk, the people, the common people, not the aristocratic class, who all spoke what language? French, no matter whether they were in the court of the czars, who most famously Frederick the Great. The true civilization comes from the common people, not the upper classes, who emphasize a kind of common culture of French civilization. And that one true civilization had to have a national character, which he will use the phrase Volksgeist, as having a national character, meaning that the people, the common people who share this, speak the same language, have the same attitude, the same spirit, and therefore are the same. Doesn't matter whether they live in Prussia or they live in Saxony. Core people, common people are the same, and that's where culture comes from. Now, by the way, these writings that come out now in the 19th century will be very influential later on. We will certainly see Hitler embrace this idea of true Germans from the common stock as a way of distancing Germany from other cultures. It will be reinforced by this movement of Romanticism that will be expressed in music, in literature, and painting, which we'll see in the Romanticism art. So it's expressed in music, and we'll get to, I have a wide variety of little excerpts of Romanticism music. Literature, which I'll just talk briefly about. Okay, and also, what did I say, painting. Let me use an example. In 1812, two brothers named the Grimm brothers, German brothers, begin then to collect and write down German folk tales, stories of the folk. All right, and they wandered around Germany doing this. And, you know, these are famous stories. The problem is that, no pun intended, but they are grim stories. All right?
Well, we read the
Disney cleaned them up.
We use the Disney version.
Yeah, the Disney version. See, we have listen, a lot of the Grimm's fairy tales were told to children, you know, in the evening, and it was to scare them. And it definitely did. All right? Whether it's Hansel and Gretel, which is
Scary.
Hansel's great.
well, if you read the original, it's even more grim.
I like the
okay?
movie.
Because that witch is eating children. Okay.
Oh, TIL.
Sleeping Beauty, Rapunzel, Rumpelstiltskin, Cinderella, Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel. There's another one called The Clever Gretel. The Snow Queen is actually Hans Christian Andersen, and I was actually starting to read it because that's the basis for Frozen. That's Hans Christian Andersen.
Hans.
That is why they named him Hans.
I mean, these are actually very interesting stories. They're not even that long, but you know, there are. You know, if you have, I have a couple of collections of these little short stories, and again, they do have lessons in them. But again, they represent, a lot of them have wolves as important characters. Now, why would wolves supposed to be a common character in the Grimm's fairy tales? Because see, these stories are taken from the roots of their history. And you need to remember that the 30 Years' War was fought in the German states. And, entire villages were destroyed, and there were accounts of soldiers coming through villages that had been wiped out 2 to 3 times in the 30 Years' War to find only wolves wandering through, eating on the corpses of the bodies. Okay? So those kind of stories are embedded in the national identity of the German people, and they're expressed in these kind of stories. So I mentioned that there. It is cultural nationalism, it's not political. When it does become political, it becomes dangerous. So, yeah, that's Hitler on the right.
Wow, that's
Oh, Hitler on the left.
What is he wearing? Listen, he is, it looks like that.
your knickerbockers.
This is the German national costume, because one of the things that Hitler begins to talk very fiercely about in his early speeches is a return to the heroic values of the past.
Is that
Okay?
like
And he's wearing
Oktoberfest
what's
too?
called the Lederhosen. And Lederhosen is a typical German style of clothing with the short pants and the knee socks. Of course, you have the German beer. So what did I do? I went and Googled Lederhosen. And then I found, okay, here are some models. Lederhosen.
Dashing.
Yeah, because they're looking cool. This is cool later.
No,
This
because
is
they're
what- this is
embarrassed,
what
so
you
they
would
want to
wear.
hide their identity.
Yeah, I know, right, probably are. So then I go online and I buy, and mostly these pants are leather pants, as we see here with 3 guys posing. And they're Lederhosen.
That's somebody's family.
You go to Germany and you're there on certain cultural days, the men are gonna get out wearing their
They look like anime
Lederhosen with their
characters.
big steins of beer. But Hitler very rarely wore it. And even the Hitler Youth costume that the Hitler Youth boys were required to wear was very similar in design to this, because it was to harken back to Germanic culture. Okay? Okay.
Wow, that really influenced me to wear
Nationalists were very
lederhosen.
much attracted to the spirit of the Volksgeist. And again, it's going to be reinforced by Romanticism. It really emphasizes, emotion and the genius kind of coming out and differences between cultures instead of reason and rationality. So emotion, genius. Yeah, and we see these. I'll give you an example now that I'll reinforce later on. A lot of the stories. One Romanticist story is Frankenstein. Frankenstein is considered a Romanticist story, and in it is you have a genius scientist, a mad scientist. Okay, and I'll talk about it being kind of anti-science, anti-technology that the Age of Enlightenment represents. But what the French Revolution showed, okay, that really, it made the German people aware of the nation state as potentially powerful, as its ideas will be spread pretty widely. So our Germans had really been non-political, but then the French Revolution showed them of an awareness of what a nation state could do and how powerful a nation state could be. And by the way, the Germans were very embarrassed about their history. There was nothing for them to really brag about. 30 Years' War, not so. Napoleon rolling over them consistently, selling each other out, so that poor Prussia was defeated at Jena, okay, in what was called the Shame of the Princes. All right, there was nothing to brag about. That's why when Hitler comes to power, he's got to go way back. He's got to go back to the medieval period in a kind of Nordic mythology, okay, of a kind of Valhalla, Viking-oriented kind of background. Okay? Yeah, because that's Germanic that we talked about, the Germanic barbarianism that we saw first with the Germanic tribes that rolled through, to destroy the Roman Empire, and then the later Germans, the Vikings, came down. So, cultural nationalism will become political. And then nationalism becomes inherently revolutionary. Once it becomes political, it becomes revolutionary. And once it's revolutionary, it's going to be seen as dangerous to the powers in being. And therefore, the people are going to have to organize themselves into secret societies to battle the powers. And so what we have is a proliferation of secret societies in the 19th and 20th centuries. The most famous of them were the Carbonari of Italy. And they will have various branches established. And these were secret societies, or they organized themselves to overthrow tyranny. Okay, and you know they met secretly. They had secret handshakes and secret codes, this kind of thing. You know.
Don't say that's so cute.
Cute.
Isn't the most
But
famous
I'm
the
just telling you,
Illuminati?
it's going to get pretty deadly once they start forming in Russia to try and kill the Tsar. And various czars that we'll talk about, the emperor hunt as it was known by various groups. And then the most famous one you're familiar with is the Black Hand Society, okay, that killed the Archduke Francis Ferdinand that started World War I. All right? So there are branch groups in France. Eastern Europe, we're going to see especially the groups in Eastern Europe that will become revolutionary, we'll find within them nationalistic, politically nationalistic, include the Poles, obviously, who are anti-rap. Somebody comes in, you would all know what I mean, and they would think I'm weird. Okay, the Magyars, who are
They also think we're weird because we're laughing.
Austrian, and then all sorts of Slavic peoples in Austria-Hungary and in the Ottoman Empire. Here's a French Carbonari, one of the branch groups, and their aim was to overthrow tyranny. What do you see here as a representation of overthrowing tyranny? Yeah, the chains. Okay, very briefly in the last few minutes, let me just talk about German literature to introduce you to the Sturm und Drang movement. Okay. Sturm und Drang is translated as storm and stress. It's a movement in literature and music. 1760s to 1780s. And it represents in literature and in music extremes of emotion. Also representing in literature a kind of heroic figure. In music, it often created a kind, what we're going to see now, and especially as we get into the early 20th century, is we're going to see really movements in music that are going, that a lot of the public was not used to and didn't like. And in 1913 in New York, there was a basic, almost a riot at a musical production because the people didn't like what they heard. It was so extreme from their point of view. Okay, and it happened to be music like Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, which today we listen to and don't think that much of it, but you have these extremes. It was designed off to evoke fear. Goethe was seen in Germany as a cultural leader. And by the way, Goethe is interesting in that he was witness to the one battle, the name of which just goes right out of my head, where the French, it was the turning point of the French against the Prussians, where I told you where the French volunteers stormed the field in ragtag uniform, screaming, and the Prussians turned and ran. Okay, he was there to witness that and write about it. Okay, he also visited the little island, I don't know if it's a little island canopy that they built when Marie Antoinette came from Austria.
Oh, yeah, that little.
Yeah, and what he saw inside after it was already done was a mural that was painted there, and I forget, it was some kind of Roman story that if you had, I forgot what the name of it is, I would have to go back and look it up again, but it was not a good omen for Marie Antoinette. I don't know who decided to put it in there, but he commented on it. And in his literature, he really is we're moving away from the Enlightenment, where you have a confident individuals that are supreme in their control over, whether it's Napoleon crossing the Alps by David, okay, to portraits of Napoleon as a strong man. That's what we call neoclassical enlightenment. Now we're going to move away from that, and we're really going to focus on kind of the unease of man in society. The art, when you see it, you will be repelled by some of it, okay, because it was designed not with the public in mind, but with the artists, okay, and how they wanted to portray it. So you've got a youthful genius rebelling against society. It was more emotional. Probably what made him famous was the book The Sorrows of Young Werther, a young romantic hero who had fallen in love with Charlotte, his best friend's fiancée. Yeah, tension and such. But you see, in the end, what ultimately happens is it's an unrequited love that leads to suicide. Okay.
So let's go into
Yeah, right. Okay, and then he wrote an epic poem called Faust that also made him very famous.
it was rather epic.
I think that the suicide part is the whole part of kind of becoming so emotionally distraught that that your own reason can't overpower those particular thoughts. Okay? Two other things I want to briefly mention that remain very strong after 1815. After 1815, two isms that remain strong are conservatism. Okay, this is the focus of the rapt countries to uphold absolutism, aristocracy, and the church. So our rapt countries upholding absolutism, aristocracy, and the church, and opposed to any kind of liberalism. And then the other one that really develops in the age of the Enlightenment to continue to strengthen is called humanitarianism. And this is really a response to the cruelty of the time. Eliminating torture, improving conditions in prisons, which were horrible, orphanages, which were horrible, insane asylums, which were really horrible, and even hospitals, which you did not want to go into because you probably wouldn't come out alive. Yes.
Would you have a better chance of being outside of the hospital?
Yes,
Oh,
you're
God.
better outside of going in. People went to hospitals to die.
Oh.
It's not like today. Also, a concern for child labor, slaves in America, and in Africa, slavery. All right, so those things. Humanitarianism will withstand the test of time. Okay, so what we're going to start with here is 1815 to 1830. A little bit of leaks before the big flood of revolts start. Okay, so, and 1815 represents what date for what event? The Congress of Vienna. And I'll pick up with the Holy Alliance then, and they are represented by our RAP countries.